This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's ChangeMaker has dedicated her career to improving housing opportunities for those in need. As the executive director of the Louisville Metro Housing Authority, Elizabeth Strojan has brought a fresh vision and determination to this critical role. Prior to joining Louisville, Elizabeth served as the Senior Vice President and Chief of Staff at the New York City Housing Development Corporation, where she honed her skills in navigating complex housing challenges and forging innovative solutions. Now Elizabeth is applying that expertise to revitalizing Louisville's public housing system. Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Let's start off, if you don't mind, reflecting on how you came into affordable housing, and then ultimately I would love to hear about your journey becoming the executive director of the Louisville Metro Housing Authority.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this question. I also always love to ask people how they came into housing. What's your housing journey? So I always appreciate the opportunity to tell my story in hopes it inspires others to join us here in the housing world. So I came into affordable housing a little bit by accident. I joined the Peace Corps right after college. And when I came back from the Peace Corps, I had to figure out, well, how did I want to commit to public service? What would my journey in community development look like? So I decided that I needed a graduate degree, and I applied to Fordham University along with other schools that offered Peace Corps fellowships, because I thought I just made like $2,000 a year as a Peace Corps volunteer. I can't really afford to finance my own graduate degree, so let's find someone that would help me pay for it. So I ended up being accepted to Fordham University on a Peace Corps fellowship. So that helped finance my graduate degree in economics and political economy and development. And as part of that, I was assigned to work in the community. And it was a little bit random that I got assigned to work for the University Neighborhood Housing Program. I think the question that led me there was the director of the program at Fordham said, "Who likes to work really hard?" And I thought, that sounds like me. So I raised my hand. And so I was assigned to the University Neighborhood Housing Program. So I worked there like 15 or 20 hours a week while I was in graduate school. And I was put on projects that really focused on research and helping to inform advocacy positions. So I was researching the history of banking in the Bronx, which is a traditionally redlined community. And I researched the state of housing affordability in the Bronx. And the Bronx in New York City is very much the last stop. If you can't afford to live in the Bronx, you cannot afford to stay in New York City. So if you get priced out of the Bronx, there's literally nowhere to go. And Nowhere to Go was the name of the report I did in my second year of the fellowship there at the University Neighborhood Housing Program. So when I wrapped up graduate school, I really didn't know where my journey would take me. I was applying to jobs literally all over the world, thinking maybe I'd return to international development. But I ended up being approached by Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national affordable housing group that does advocacy and policy work. They do low-income housing tax credit syndication, other kinds of nonprofit programming for affordable housing. So I went to work for the New York office of Enterprise as a research and policy fellow. And I remember when I started working at Enterprise, I had to Google LIHTC in one of my first meetings. I was like, I don't even know what these people are talking about. And I spelled it wrong. I spelled it like LITEC. And look at me now. So I worked at Enterprise. I quickly learned what LIHTC is and how important it is to the affordable housing community. And I just had this moment early on in my days at Enterprise where I realized affordable housing is my calling. This is how I am going to make the world a better place, how I'm going to make things a little bit more fair for people. I felt like I'd found my footing in my journey when I was at Enterprise. And after a few years at Enterprise, working in the nonprofit space, working on policy, I'd worked my way up a little bit at Enterprise. I was approached by the New York City Housing Development Corporation, which is New York City's housing finance agency. I was asked to come run their government affairs, specifically focused on federal affairs. I really enjoyed my time doing that. It was also very intense and a lot to coordinate. But from there, I was asked by the New York City Housing Development Corporation to serve as its chief of staff and senior vice president for administration. And that was just a whole other entree into affordable housing. I went from really focusing primarily on external affairs and messaging and advocacy to really digging into the operations of a housing agency, really digging into staffing issues and financing affordable housing. It was an incredible opportunity that just allowed me to see so many things at a high level and to dig in where I wanted. It was an amazing opportunity that I'll always be extremely grateful for. In early 2023, I just felt like I needed to come home to Louisville. Louisville is home for me. I'd been in New York City at that point over a decade, but I felt like I needed to come home. And so I started to reach out to my network, which at that point was really a national network of housers, and let people know that, I was looking for an opportunity in Louisville so that I can bring my now 2 boys that I had in New York City home to be raised near family. And so in talking to people here in the city of Louisville, both who worked for the government and who worked in housing and in other sectors, it became clear that the city of Louisville really needed new leadership at the Louisville Metro Housing Authority. Louisville has been through an incredible amount in the last few years, not just within the housing authority, but just like the rest of society. We went through a global pandemic. We went through racial uprisings in the aftermath of the killing of Breonna Taylor. And it was a time when Louisville looked around and said, we have to invest in housing, and the housing authority has to be a big part of that. So it was honestly very fortuitous for me. I feel extremely grateful that I felt this need to come home at the same time where this incredible job opportunity came together. So I just thought, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. I have to go home and do this. And here I am, 4 months into the job.
You have such a unique blend of working in a nonprofit to analytics and research and your government roles. But I really am impressed also by the footing that you got in public service. And that community development, I'm sure, is paying back in sort of a way with the role that you're doing now. Not many people get their footing in the Peace Corps. So what a unique experience to have that early on. And then now to see how you're actually in your own hometown doing some similar service, I guess I could describe it. Do you see parallels in those two universes, how you started and where you are now?
That's a great question. I think about my Peace Corps service, lessons learned there, mistakes made that I learned from there all the time in this job. When I was in the Peace Corps, I served in Madagascar in 2007 to 2009. I was an environmental education volunteer. So that is something I knew very little about until I got to Madagascar and was lucky enough to be trained by the Peace Corps. So I was learning a new skill and then teaching that skill to farmers in Madagascar in their native language, a language that I had to learn on the ground there. That is the best training ground for anything you want to do in life, because nothing is going to be as challenging as culture shock, learning a new language you had never even heard of, developing a new skill that you were not aware was important or even existed, and then teaching that to people who have been doing something one way their entire life, and you're trying to convince them to do something in a slightly different way in hopes that it would better their life. That was an incredible opportunity that I had. It really helped me learn how to connect with people. Even if you can't say everything you want to say in the language, or even if you can't connect because you come from very different backgrounds on everything, you can always connect with every single person on something. And that's a life skill that very few people have the opportunity to get. So when I'm here in this seat, I have the opportunity as the executive director of the Louisville Metro Housing Authority to talk to all kinds of people from every walk of life. I get to talk to congressmen and other elected officials. I get to talk to finance people and developers, bankers. I get to talk to civil leaders throughout the whole city and the whole county. And I get to talk to residents. And I think about all the time how important it is in every conversation to make sure I'm making that connection, to make sure I'm learning everything I possibly can from what they're telling me. And that is something that I really learned to do in the Peace Corps. So I think about this all the time. In my time here, we have had many meetings, many community meetings and resident meetings that have been, frankly, quite difficult. We have people who have lived in conditions that are not acceptable. We have people who are extremely angry at the Louisville Metro Housing Authority. And it's my job to facilitate those conversations and to listen and learn everything I can so that I can inform the next steps of the agency. And I think about, when I'm in front of 80 residents or 100 residents and the news cameras are there and people are mad, I just think about, oh, I can do this. I've stood in front of farmers in Madagascar who know everything about rice farming, and here I am trying to explain how rice farming works in a different language with no shoes on, wearing clothes that no longer fit, all that. Like, I've done that. I can do this. It helps give me confidence in interacting with people, and it helps me pick out the pieces that I need to hear from people.
You're also explaining a level of authenticity that you have learned, because trying to talk with anybody in their environment and help organize them and lead them to a productive conclusion of what their needs are or what the path or the input is, whatever those dynamics are, but you're doing it with such authenticity that's very impressive. And then if you layer on the home component of Louisville, I'm sure that you really are poised well and set very well to move the Housing Authority to this next phase, which leads me to my next thought here. If you could dream anything for the Housing Authority and then combine it with some strategic planning, what do you envision is your path for the immediate term and then maybe the next 4 or 5 years?
That's a great question. What we're focused on at LMHA right now is stabilizing our operations. Just like housing authorities all over the country, we are on the heels of decades of underfunding for public housing capital and operations, increasingly complex regulations in the Section 8 program, increasingly vulnerable residents that we need to serve. And we're also coming on the heels of a pandemic where we, like other government agencies and many companies in the country, really saw a lot of staff leave. So we have a lot of work to do at LMHA to stabilize our operations. We do 4 main things here. The first is that we own and operate public housing. We have nearly 3,000 units of public housing. We have nearly 11,000 Section 8 vouchers. I'm sorry, we actually have more than 11,000 Section 8 vouchers. It's the largest Section 8 program in the state of Kentucky. Thirdly, we have 4 mixed income communities that are former public housing sites that have been redeveloped into mixed finance communities. And fourth, we have special programs that span all of those areas that offer things like social work supportive services, that's a little light touch, as well as financial empowerment. All of those things are huge mandates. We need to be able to do all of those things extremely well. And that is what we're working on right now. Each of those areas has a lot of room for improvement. So this year we are focused on figuring out where our gaps are, figuring out where we've fallen short, and being extremely honest about that. We are in no way, shape, or form trying to hide what's wrong here. Now is the time to raise our hands and say, you know what? We've lost track of this. We've lost control of that, and just name it so that we can stabilize it and make a plan to go forward. So this year we are naming it and we are focused on stabilization. That will bleed into 2025 because it takes time to staff up, to get back into compliance, to bring in the teams that we need to get things back on track. But our next step is going to be innovating. The Louisville Metro Housing Authority is a moving to work agency. and we're one of the original moving to work agencies in the country. We have a tremendous amount of regulatory flexibility and budgeting flexibility that the vast majority of public housing authorities in the country do not have. We have the ability to do new, cool, innovative things, and we really need to be doing that on behalf of the people of Louisville and the state of Kentucky. We can't get there yet. This year, like I said, we're really focused on stabilizing our operations, and I'm happy to talk more about that, Katie, if you'd like. But when we get stable, when we're staffed up, I am excited to see where we can go. And one of the things I really want to figure out here with the capacity and the resources that we have is how are we planning for housing plus mental health services for the future? The residents that we're serving, both in public housing and in the Section 8 program, are lower income than before, and they tend to have additional barriers to housing more so now than they did in the past. So we really need to be thinking about more models for housing plus services. And I think LMHA can be on the forefront of that.
Not just dealing with the effectiveness and filling that gap, but this unique piece that you just mentioned, the mental health services. Tell us a little bit more about that.
When I started at LMHA, I knew that we were going to have issues in our public housing portfolio with physical conditions. Unfortunately, that's the case for public housing authorities in many parts of the country. We have not been funded sufficiently to keep up the way we need to keep up with the physical conditions in the building. So what you see a lot is the public housing authorities that have not yet repositioned their portfolio from public housing into a different HUD program, typically Section 8, and the ability to leverage additional resources. You see physical conditions that are not ideal, or you see outdated buildings. I knew that that was going to be an issue in Louisville because it's an issue everywhere. What I was surprised about when I got here was how much mental health issues were pervasive in our portfolio. We have sites that were designed and opened to serve seniors. And over the years, we could no longer maintain that senior designation with HUD. We were asked to house people with disabilities of all ages. And those disabilities could be physical or mental. And so over the years, we saw the population changing in what used to be our senior buildings. And I do not believe that we did a good job keeping up with the service needs of those changing populations. We continued to have very light touch services, or you could call to get in touch with a social worker who could help you with things. Those are all great, but what the people in our properties needed was much more intense level of case management in many cases. Then a few years ago, LMHA instituted a homelessness preference in our public housing portfolio. And that was an incredible thing that we did. It was kind. It was necessary at the time, especially through COVID. I truly believe that LMHA's homelessness preference saved lives by getting people off the street and into stable housing during the height of the pandemic. What we did not do, we did not provide an appropriate level of supportive services for people moving straight into housing off the street. That was a huge disservice that we did. So what we see now at LMHA, I think, is an unfortunate but also valuable case study in what happens when you mix populations of various service needs without the services. You see an increased deterioration in the physical conditions of the building, and you see people really in need of help. And when people are vulnerable and placed in situations where they're surrounded by a lot of households that also have serious unmet service needs, that can really feed off of each other and help spiral downward. So what we have to do, what we've done since I've started, is work to stabilize these properties. It's not all of our properties, but there's a handful of properties that used to be senior housing that are now serving people with serious mental illness, many of whom are in the throes of addiction as we speak. So we are stabilizing operations there in those properties. And one of the things that we're doing is we're bringing in additional social workers, and we're offering case management level services as opposed to the light touch services only that we've been providing. But that's, again, a stabilization plan. That's really not the long-term solution. So what I see as our need going forward, these are the residents that we're serving. We need to be honest about that and admit that, and we have to forge the partnerships that we need to provide serious services on site to the people we're housing. That said, I'm not sure that we currently have an appropriate model for everyone that we're serving. The permanent supportive housing model, I believe in wholeheartedly. It is incredibly important to provide permanent, affordable housing for very low-income people and on-site case management services. That is very helpful, and that is what we need to stably house a vast majority of people with mental illness. However, there are people who need more structure than that. There are people who need a level of supportive services beyond permanent supportive housing, but not as much as institutionalization. So along that spectrum, we need to figure out how can we better serve people with serious, persistent mental illness that we're seeing today, the drug use issues that we're seeing today. What services do those folks need to stay stably housed?
There is an ongoing tension in the affordable housing field about the proper role of housing authorities. Some view them as simply providers of the physical dwelling, focusing on maintenance, rent calculation, and basic operations. And then others believe housing authorities should really take a more comprehensive approach, providing supportive services and addressing residents' broader needs beyond just the roof over their head. Tackling this more expansive role, as you're describing, is quite ambitious and not something many housing authorities have undertaken. And I want to get into just exactly how you're doing this, but we have to take a break here. So the next time on ChangeMakers, Elizabeth Strojan, the Executive Director of the Louisville Metro Housing Authority, will talk about the emotional process of relocating residents of one of their high-rise properties.
There are people who, the first time I met them, residents of Dosker Manor would say, "I'm ready to move. Can I have a voucher now? Please get me out of here." I also met people the first time I'm talking to them and they're saying, "I'm nervous that you're going to make me move out of here. Please don't make me move. This is my community." So it's a mix of emotions and everybody is very anxious.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.